Hello, hello. Welcome to episode 34 of The Great Game. We had a conversation with Paddy from Pennine Megagames and all sorts of mega games over in the UK, who you might remember from 2020, I think it was, episode 13, many, many years ago, ancient history at this point, when we had a chat with Paddy at the online Mega Game Con about Running Hot. In this episode, we revisit Running Hot, but we'll specifically talking to Paddy about experiences of running mega games multiple times, which was something that we have been asked to talk about. I think it's quite an interesting conversation for people interested in doing just that, running mega games multiple times, trying to keep it fresh for the players and the people running it, but also a good place to mine some lessons from doing so, and also perhaps thinking about design elements which might make running a game that you're working on over and over an easier task. All that said, hopefully you enjoy, and I'll get on with the episode. All right. So, Paddy, for those who have not already listened to the previous episode that we had you on, which, as you just reminded me, was 4 years ago, I think it was episode 13. But when we talked about Running Hot, those who haven't heard that already, who are you? tell us how you came to be where you are in the mega game. Yeah, who let you in?
Well, to be fair, you invited me here.
Yes.
My name's Patrick Rose. I'm a mega game player and designer who lives in the UK, and I'm part of the Pennine Megagames region. When I first was on here, I was just someone who was involved in Pennine Megagames, and now I'm the secretary for it. So I'm the one that tries to make sure that we have games running, handles the emails, and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
So, you'll be shocked to hear that as someone who started playing mega games after 2014, I came into it using like a video of some kind. I don't know whether you've heard of it. There's this group called Shut Up and Sit Down, and they did this like thing, a video called like Watch the Skies, something like that. I can't remember all the details. So yeah, that's how I came on there. Has it come up before? I don't know.
It's ancient history at this point, you know. Some the listeners barely know about that video at this point. So I appreciate you bringing it up again. No, standard origin.
We have a bingo card yet for the Great Game. Like we probably should have one.
We probably should.
We should.
Well, thank you for joining us again. Hopefully, it'll be a good chat, and we can get you back in another 4 years. But today, I did mention Running Hot. That was what we talked about back in 2020. You were just saying before we started recording that you've actually been involved in that game running 6 times in a very short span of time. 8 months, was it?
Something like that. Like, yeah. So because of the pandemic, a lot of my games didn't run. I was one of the people that was trying to talk to people and make sure that we could port some games. So if you look at like the first MegaCon, I think I did a talk about how to port a game online. And realistically, the people wanted to play mega games, but there weren't a lot of games that had been ported. So that's the main reason Running Hot got like so many runs, was because it was like you had Running Hot, you had Den of Wolves, you had Andrew's Red Planet Rising, and you kind of had nothing else. So like there was a lot of reason why Running Hot has had as much exposure as it did is because of like a lack of supply more than anything.
Right.
But also, I think people did actually enjoy playing it. For those who still haven't listened to the episode from 4 years ago, and you probably should have done by now, so Running Hot is a pre-Cyberpunk mega game. What I wanted to do was I wanted to set a game at the point at the beginning of the Cyberpunk like lore, as opposed to the standard stuff where it's already a corporate hellscape. So Running Hot's set at a point where the government is going, we've got some terrible economic issues. The way we're going to solve this is we're going to sell a whole bunch of land to 5 mega corporations, and I'm sure it's going to go fine. Of the various runs we've had, it's gone fine sort of like maybe like 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time it does just become a corporate hellscape. So but I was interested in exploring that as a thing, because it didn't feel to me like the corporate hellscape wasn't a required outcome of it. Obviously it is for those sorts of fictions, but I was interested to see whether if you actually set people there, like how long does it take before they start becoming like utter assholes? Do they try and pretend to be good? And a lot of the time they do try to be good. I reckon if the game went on longer, or it was like a legacy style format, I think eventually it would probably always converge into dystopia.
Yeah.
Because I think because of the fact that Running Hot's set at the beginning of this like new nation that's getting set up, and they know they've got a load of eyes on them. They're trying to be good, and they're just waiting for someone to take their eye off the ball, and then they can go and be evil.
Yep.
So what would you say is the ratio of good endings to dystopian endings, roughly, in the 6 runs you've seen?
I mean, the dystopian ending is a good ending as far as I'm concerned, but
Of course.
so I think you end up. I think it is roughly around 50-50. I could probably like go through and look at all the various spreadsheets and pull that up. It's usually what happens is someone does something, and I go, "Are you sure you want to do that? It's going to end badly." And they're like, "No, it's not going to end badly." And then it ends badly, and that kind of like starts like the absolute slide into chaos. Like that's a thing that always seems to happen.
Especially in any mega game that has corporations, it seems like a sure bet. Eventually, there's just a graph where it'll meet, the two lines will meet, chaos versus civility when the corporations are involved. So you said that you have run this game many times. I mean, so you designed the game and you were running it back in 2020. You've run it a lot recently. Do you know how many times it has been run in its whole life cycle? Or is that...
I think it's somewhere in the region of 8.
Okay.
Somewhere around there. So it had the initial run where we had our first chat. It then ran again like 2 weeks afterwards because I apparently hate myself. And then I think it had maybe like 3 or 4 runs in 2021. And then I ran it with one of the universities here. I then like put it on myself last year, and then I'm doing another run this year, and probably one more run next year, and then I am going to put it down for a while because again, that's a lot of runs for a game in quite a condensed period of time.
Yes. Well, tell Jim Mormon that, I suppose.
Jim doesn't run Watch the Skies like every 3 months. Like it's other people running it.
That's right. Yeah, which is something I'm interested to delve into here. So I suppose, just for context, we were contacted by a listener, Salette, from Geneva, who wrote to us earlier this year with a bit of a back catalogue of questions and requests for things that we could talk about. So we highly appreciate that. But one thing was specifically how people can keep games fresh when they're running them over and over and over and over. The example that they pulled up was Den of Wolves, but I know it definitely applies to games like Watch the Skies, which are being run out every week across the world these days. And then there's a lot of hidden gems, like, for example, I know that God Emperor has been run many times in many different places at this point, and obviously Running Hot as well. So I wanted to talk about that and how that differs, how that experience differs, I suppose, from running a mega game for the first time, or returning to it after a few years off. How that differs to running the same thing over and over and over, especially if you've got the same team running it or a different team, if you have the same players or a different group of players, how you balance, I suppose, the convenience of running a game over and over with the need to keep it fresh and interesting for the people who are involved. Have you, Paddy, had much experience running games over and over, like more than once, I suppose, outside Running Hot?
So yeah, Den of Wolves was like another one that I think I think if you look at like my control history, a good proportion of it just seems to be me running Den of Wolves, which was odd. But again, like most of my initial control experience was during the pandemic, and again, like there was a limited number of games that were able to be run for that sort of stuff. But the other game, so I was control for both of the first versions of First Contact, which I can't remember what the subtitle of the First Contact is. So I was on that. I was on the control team for both those things, and that game was essentially the same on both those runs. And then they've switched across to Reign of Terror, which now has a completely different set of rules and not rules. I think like the aliens are mainly different, and that's the thing. I think they've switched up a couple of the company objectives and like country objectives, things like that. I think the other one that I've been involved in a couple of times was another game that Andrew Shield Dodds wrote, which is called Are You Now or Have You Ever Been, which is a game of like 1960s America where everyone is like living in a nice like white picket fence house, but secretly they're all like werewolves, witches, or worse, communists. So
yes,
there's a couple of games that I have been involved with that have run multiple times, and I've been like on the control team. Like the only game that I have run multiple times has been Running Hot, but I've been involved in several games because I think a lot of one of the old guard of mega gamers kind of would write a game once and then they'd run it and they'd be like, great, I've now explored the thing that I was trying to explore. A lot of the newer people are going, I've spent like 200 hours building this thing. I can't just run this once. Like,
yes,
the return on investment's nowhere near good enough. So
yeah.
I think that happens a lot with some people.
I think my design mind falls in that old guard way of thinking, but my desire to run games falls in the new, where I wish I could just run the same thing over and over. And we're getting better at it now in Sydney, but none of my designs just yet. Jack, you've got a few repeat game runs under your belt.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've watched this kind of a few times in Brisbane, and we are not alone as well, of course, which is a variant that we designed on those same basic ideas. And yeah, God Emperor has been run quite a few times around the world, and we are preparing to run it again in Brisbane. My own design vibe is definitely the same of like always getting sick of things really quickly and wanting to move on to the next thing. I remember when I finished God Emperor, I was just so sick of God Emperor. I put it down and didn't want to look at it for a decent amount of time. But it's funny because in my tastes as a player is always I love playing the same thing more than once. I think, when you're trying to get to grips with something the first time, it's always like trying to figure out how to even do things and what am I even doing? How does this even work? Which is all part of the magic of a mega game, obviously. But coming into it the second time when you don't have as much of that barrier and you can kind of just jump into it, understanding how it works at a basic level and start messing with things and doing stuff. That's definitely like, yeah, as a player, that's what I love most of all.
Yeah, it's I suppose you see it in the player base as well, not just necessarily the same game, but just the recurring players in general approach it very differently compared to those fresh faces that come for their first game. You can really feel the difference in the crowd. I don't know what it's like with the groups that you play with, Paddy, but here, when we do have a day where it's majority new people, it's a very, very different feeling in the room. Yeah, the energy they bring is very different.
Yeah, like there's, I can also like it kind of depends on what kind of world you've come from as well when you're looking at using games, like because some people don't realize that the game's in the spaces between the rules, and that's kind of hard to teach.
Yeah.
When it comes to stuff like one of the things that when I was talking to Melbourne, because they were running Phase Anatomy, which is another game that I designed, they were talking about one of the things they were saying is like, how do we teach players that they can just do weird stuff, like they're allowed to do something and go, well, I think that I can do this, like can I? And the things that I was saying, like if you manage to work out a way of teaching new players how to do that, then the whole world will bow down to you as gods because like no one's worked out a good way of doing it. FaZe kind of does it by giving people cards that have no mechanical benefit, so people assume that they have some use. So they therefore like it gets their brain going to work out an answer for it, but like there isn't a good way of doing it. And I think experienced players are used to just showing up and going, right, I understand the base mechanics of the stuff, I understand the way that I'm supposed to be approaching things, but I know that I can kind of dive into the gaps. I know how to look for those gaps and do things. And I think that's one of the ways that a game ends up feeling different on multiple runs. Like an experienced gamer will find those gaps, and different experienced gamers will find those gaps in different ways and attack them in different ways.
Yep, and I think there's a few people I've spoken to, I think in the UK crowd mostly, specifically about Den of Wolves, where because it has been run so many times with so many of the same people, some of them have developed approaches to the game where, they start with a lot of not not like they know what's going to happen or anything like that, but more so that they've got tactics to utilize as if you were playing a board game for the 10th time and you've got a new strategy. And that was something I'd never encountered in the mega game space until I heard these kind of anecdotes. So I guess that kind of comes round to the question about how do you keep these games fresh? Do you think that there's inherently anything wrong with running the exact same game over and over with no changes, whether they are narrative, structural, logistical, mechanical, just no changes at all, just off the shelf over and over?
It'll kind of depend where it is that you're running. So Pennine's in a bit of a Pennine covers 3 major cities, and like a lot of players that we have will come to each of those different games. But like if I run a game in Leeds, like I've got the stats. Like most people who come there are from Leeds or the surrounds. If I run a game in Sheffield, people come from Sheffield or the surrounds. If I run a game in Manchester, people will come from Manchester or the surrounds. So like we don't have, I wouldn't say like our player base is like completely split across those 3 things. Like we have people who come from all over the place to those things. So it's kind of like if you've got a completely fresh set of players, then I'd say you don't need to bother making a change. Like you can probably just run it again and then use your experience from your previous run to go, well, here are some things that happened, here's how we dealt with them and work with them. As a controller facilitator, the constant run of it will kind of like, I think would just bear down on you, and you'll be like, I'm actually like really bored of seeing the same thing. So it's for your benefit more than anything else that you start like adding those injects.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I think it also depends on what type of mega game it is. If it's a game like Watch the Skies, where there is a central mystery or plot element of what are these aliens, what do they want, what are they doing, then if the answer to that central mystery is exactly the same every time, then yeah, I think it's going to get pretty. People will get pretty sick of it. But if it is more of a sandboxy mega game where there isn't as much of a defined central mystery or plot, and it is more like giving players the tools to mess with stuff, then I think it is much easier to rerun a bunch of times, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's something you just touched on, Paddy. I guess, so just quickly backtracking, in Sydney, we haven't run the same game over and over lots of times, but in our current run, we're running everything twice in a row because, like back to back almost, because we do have capacity with the audience, like the audience size. We've just run Infinite Horizons. I was lucky enough not to be in charge of running that, but Dave, who I think people will have heard from by the time they hear this, ran both of those games, and it was really important to him in preparing the team, the facilitator team between the two, that they were having fun, so that anything that wasn't fun from that control perspective in game 1 was tweaked or fixed or changed, because I think a lot of the time, especially if you're only a player, it might be easy to forget that the facilitators are still investing all of that energy and time as the players are as well. And it's really important that they actually get an entertaining day out of it. It can't just be the stress of a job. I think that's really important, making sure that team is also entertained. Is that something that you've had in mind with running Hot, Paddy? You've had to run it many times. Have you had to think about ways to keep the control team happy and engaged?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a difference between a well-established game and a game like Running Hot, which basically I threw out of a cliff like 4 years ago and was hoping it would fly. So like the second run of that game was very similar to the first, but like with a whole bunch of like changes to it. So I was like, oh, that didn't work very well. And then the next run of that, which was the January, so I think it was like maybe 3 months later, had like some more stuff to make the UX of playing the game easier for players, as opposed to the horrific things that I'd done because I was trying to get it all working initially, and that was the main thing. And then from there, Running Hot's remained pretty stable as it is. So those first three runs, the game was definitely recognizable between those ones, but there was like, if I remember, like I had a role that didn't do anything as a player, and then I switched across to a different role, and that player had like the worst time ever. And then I was like, okay, I can't just solve this problem. I'm just going to remove that role. And then from then, it kind of worked a lot better. The first two runs had pretty much exactly the same plot. Like every plot line was the same. Then I think we switched things up in the January run. I can't remember what we did for that. So we kept it different from. We made it up. We made changes so that players didn't know necessarily what to expect, but also it meant that we could start exploring some new and interesting, like cyberpunk dystopian, like threads on top of that. So like there's, I mean, the way that I always kind of like write plots for my games is always like, what is it that a player's going to turn around to me and go, I can't believe you've done this to me. So like, a lot of the way that I write games is to make myself laugh at the expense of my players. So good luck to anyone who wants to play any of my games. I'm not laughing at you. I'm kind of laughing with you, but also I'm laughing at you. Like that's kind of how I approach it. So like, I want to make sure that it's different for a player, and that means that I can then enjoy the bit of control, which is where you're kind of like you're having to improv and think on your feet, and I quite like having my feet to the fire. I think my control team tend to enjoy that as well. So it's hopefully they do. Otherwise, I'm really sorry. But like they can at least like look at the thing, and they know where this plot is supposed to kind of go. They know how it's supposed to like intersect in some interesting way. So they're not like completely blind, but they can kind of improvise to make sure it continues working in an interesting way.
Yeah.
So with running it in those last few runs where things are pretty solid and quite similar between game to game, have you noticed any sense of a meta growing up, or like are there specific decisions that you find specific teams will always do this one thing, or that there's this one strategy that people are latching onto? Like, are there any points like that people seem to latch onto with the game, or that they do similarly from run to run?
I definitely noticed that people worked out that the best way of protecting your facility was to convince people to never attack your facility. And like the first couple of runs, that didn't happen. And then like most of the online runs, I think, had a very high proportion of returning players for it. So a lot of people had played it like 2 or 3 times at least, so they kind of knew what to expect from the mechanics of the game. And yeah, it's really interesting watching some people go, oh, I'm just gonna. Some people are like, okay, well, I need to protect my facilities, and I could like use all these mechanic stuff, and hopefully I'll be fine. Or I could just go talk to all the runners and say, you know what, like here's some money, just don't come and attack me, and then just watch that happen. Like that, there was always going to be like some strategy which works. And like the advantage of that as a strategy, which like the game kind of suggests, like the game, a lot of the rulebook suggests in Running Hot that you should, like the cards in front of your facility aren't actually your main form of defense. The other form of defense is you speaking to other people and convincing them not to attack you, or you playing a shell game so that you've moved stuff around so that people don't necessarily know can't find the thing that they're looking for because they thought it was in facility 1, but actually you moved it to facility 3 like a turn ago, but they haven't learnt that difference. So there's definitely a meta for Running Hot. I think that it hasn't run online for a while, so hopefully people have forgotten a lot of that meta. Having said that, I've just explained what the meta is, so we'll see what happens. But I think any mega game, because like you have got some mechanics, there is always going to be like the right answer to those, and the thing that I always kind of look for when I'm designing is like, how do I convince you to make a suboptimal move, but because it makes sense for you to make that suboptimal move. Like if you look at the mechanic and go, here is all the right answer, like what can I do to convince you on a narrative layer or with some other mechanic to make your move less good, so that then you end up with like a more interesting game state. Like especially if you've got mechanics fighting against each other, then you've got like a fun problem in your head to go, well, how do I optimize this situation? I mean, granted, it still eventually will have an optimal solution, and you're trying to make it, trying to hide it for the 8 turns of the game. But for a rerun, people work it out. I find it more interesting to use the narrative layer to kind of force you into bad decisions, because people go, oh, well, I'm supposed to care about this thing, so I'm going to throw all my resource into protecting this thing and all this other stuff, which is actually really important and is really valuable. Like, I've been told I don't care about it, so I'm just going to continue not caring about it.
Yeah. When we spoke about Running Hot originally, you had, I think you had like a fair few ideas about things that you would like to change mechanically, to tweak it as you go. In the life cycle of the game, when you've run it so many times, have changes that you've made to the game continued to be mechanical throughout that period, or was there a point where you said, nope, enough's enough, I'm only going to tweak, the player experience or the roles or the briefs or that kind of thing? Or has it been a continuous labor of love mechanically?
I think since that January run, I've made one change to the rule. I made that change last year, which was to handle, like, if you fail the run, one thing I was never happy about was if you failed a run, you got nothing. And that meant that you'd spent a whole turn, spent a lot of resources, and got absolutely nothing for it, which kind of meant a load of people stalled in some way. So I eventually realized that that's not great. That's not a particularly useful experience for people. And like running hot runs for 8 turns or so, like it's not a particularly long game. So if you end up ending your turn doing a run and getting nothing out of it, that's an eighth of your day you've wasted. So I that's the change, and that change I made last year to kind of like solve that thing. But since then, it has remained static. So, and again, like when you buy like a Den of Wolves, when you buy Watch the Skies, like the rules that you get are mostly going to remain static. I know that some people will add little bolt-ons to Watch the Skies in some way. And like I guess like those bolt-ons, they will probably run them a couple of times to kind of work out what the kinks are, like any like fresh mega game design. Then again, like those will remain static. And once your rules remain static, I think the only real target you've got is the player experience. So like Running Hot now has some like fancy cards that I paid someone to design, as opposed to the awful black on white thing that I wrote. Things like just because I needed something quickly. So now I've got like something designed by an actual art designer, and then everything else that changes with Running Hot is now entirely on the narrative layer. So the whole plots that the game has, the individual briefs that people have. Running Hot has a brief. Every single player has a personal brief. Again, because I hate myself, so that's 39 briefs that I have to write for every single run of the game, which is a lot of work. I mean, granted, like I I know that I don't read a brief if it's like 6 pages long, so each of the briefs are like half a page long.
Yeah.
And basically say like, here's the situation, here's the things that you need to worry about. Like, do you want to like here's a brief situation, here are the things that you want. Here's like a couple of starting points that you can use to go off and do those things. And then on the control side, I'll say, right, here are the plots of the game. Here are the things that people care about. Here's probably what the end looks like. Here's like a couple of steps on that path. And then like we just let it be shaped by what actually happens in play. Like some players might never interact with their plot. Some players will really dig into their plot in some interesting way. But they might attack it in a way that we weren't expecting. But as long as we know what the rough end goal is, then it matters. I think like one of the bits of DM advice that I got like absolutely ages ago was like when you're writing like a mystery or like an interaction, if there's information that players need to know, you don't need to write how they get that information. Like you can, as long as you know the information that they're supposed to get, you can kind of just let them attack it in a way that makes sense, and then give them the information in a format that makes sense. So let's say you're investigating some monster attack, like they could go to the city guard, and the information that the guard will tell them will be, oh, here are the sort of like defenses, here's like the military aspect to it. If you went to speak to like the politician, they'd be saying like, oh, all the people are telling me these things, and I want you to deal with it because it's going to help me get reelected. Like those, they all have like different ways of getting things, but on a mechanical level, you've told them exactly the same thing. You've told them, here's the monster, like here's how it kills people. Please, could you stop it from killing people? But the way they got that information is like slightly different in its texture, and like that's the way that I think you should always be writing those sorts of plots. Like have those informations, make sure that you've written the information that they need to know, but you don't really care how they get it, and then you can flavor it as expected.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Mhm.
And so I guess the lessons I'm distilling for people who are intimidated by running the same game over and over is probably, don't forever tweak the mechanics. That's not going to be productive, and you'll probably go mad. And measure the effort that you're going to put in if you want to customize the experience every single time. Be moderate. If you're going to write briefings every single time, keep them short. 100% agree with that. Jack, does any of this resonate with your experiences running
Yeah,
games?
absolutely. So I think the part about being able to get some nice, like, work on those, secondary things after in future runs, like the, making cards nicer and all that kind of thing, is probably the most one of the biggest reasons that it's great to run a game multiple times, because you get the time and energy to do that kind of thing. Like Jason, this next run of God Emperor is working on a wonderful digital dashboard that shows the status of each house and all that kind of thing, which looks absolutely fantastic. And that's something that would make literally no sense if you're running the game once, right? Like there's no reason to even think about doing something like that. So that's yeah, that is one huge benefit of running them multiple times.
Yeah, definitely. I think so the games that we've run multiple times now in Sydney, I did run one of mine before the pandemic twice, once in Sydney, once in Melbourne, but it was very like a version 1, version 2 of the game. A lot of changes happened between the two. But since we've been back, we've ran God Emperor twice, we've ran the Generalissimo is Dead twice, and we've just run Infinite Horizons twice. And I think between all of those, maybe not so much God Emperor because it is quite defined already, but for the other two games, Generalissimo is Dead and Infinite Horizons, running games from overseas designers that we were sort of adapting here, a big thing that we were looking at was the logistics of actually running them. So the physical movement on the day, where things should be, how we should lay out the venue, making it a more helpful experience for the players and a simpler experience for the facilitators, particularly with Infinite Horizons. It has a huge amount of moving parts, just physical pieces and components and that kind of thing. Paddy, you've run the game. You've run things like Running Hot, both online and in I think you said earlier, Meat Space. Is that the term?
Yeah, it's a cyberpunk
Have
game,
you
so
done?
therefore, like I had to use meat space. It's the rules.
Of course, of course. Have you learnt lessons in that logistic space as well, running the same thing over and over, but realizing, in Meat Space, it turns out if you have those two tables right next to each other, it just saves a huge amount of time and it doesn't actually detract from the experience. Have you learnt those kind of things as well?
Bits and pieces. So you have the constant thing where doing stuff online will either be faster or slower depending on what it is that you're doing. Doing things in like playing a card in real life is really easy because you just play the card, whereas online you have to find the card in your hand and mess around with the interface to kind of deal with it. So like bits of it are slower than things. What I was definitely surprised at when Running Hot ran in person was like I thought the run mechanic was going to be really, really heavy, like on the calculations. but actually it turned out it ran pretty well with the cheat sheets that I had that were there, so people could just move trackers on them. So like the bit, like obviously if that had gone horribly wrong, I'd have had to rethink an awful lot of the game. But because I was happy with how it all worked, and because I although it doesn't necessarily match, like, but when I'm running a game online in Discord, I can kind of just watch where people are going, so I can go, well, I know that they have to go from here to here and then back again, so I can set up my room in that sort of way to kind of like make it so that a player doesn't have to go like cross to the other side of the room to do something for 2 minutes and then come all the way back to kind of deal with that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably a particularly, I mean, both online and in person, but particularly from my experience in person, I feel like that's one of the things that it is worth investing sort of continuous improvement in. If there's improvement to be made, sometimes, there's only so much you can do with the space that you've got. But we've just been talking to a few different groups in South America, and they're very enthusiastic about running games over and over. Well, not over and over necessarily, but high volume of games. And there's been a lot of watch the skies happening there. And I imagine that's something, it's something that they've both mentioned was a big focus, learning learning on the run, I suppose, which is what Jack and I did here as well, seeing that video and just deciding to take a shot at it, and then figuring out all these tiny little lessons about layout and table space and how to manage players arriving and all that kind of logistical event management stuff, which I guess you only learn from experience, but I'm sure there's some general tips out there that someone should probably compile. We can outsource that. But yeah, I was just fascinated by that because observing the reruns that we've done now, you can see the at least the facilitator experience improve significantly between runs because people just get what works and what doesn't, and where they need to be, and how much time they've got for things. It's very different from just reading on paper, I suppose. So I guess the logistics, like staying on logistics of running games many times, and I am interested in the online space as well. Paddy, you were saying how over time you've been able to improve like the quality of components and that type of thing. Have you also been able to sort of optimize the kind of components you need or minimize them, for example? How has the production of the game changed over time?
Remained pretty static. I would say like the things that like the game kind of just works as it is. So like there isn't much like chance for like moving things around. Like the main things that changed on the online run down the line was basically we made the spreadsheets that people were using like slightly easier to use. They're still not like they're not as easy as doing things like with your hands, like the trying to use a spreadsheet to put like 6 cards in a specific order and making sure you're using like the right IDs. Like that's not fun. No one thinks it's fun. There's not really anything we can do about it, apart from like completely write a custom interface, which I'm not particularly interested in doing because I don't think that, again, if I'm planning on putting Running Hot down for a while, then I don't want to invest that effort. And then like the change in person, like Running Hot's like a very card driven game. I don't remember how many cards it is. I think it's certainly in the region of at least 1,000. So I think, and I didn't, because when you run things online, it doesn't matter how many copies of a card you have because you've got infinite because you're running things online. And then when you're running things in person, you actually have to work out how many you need of each specific thing. I'm fairly certain that I've overprinted like various things because I couldn't work out what the actual number was. I probably underprinted some other ones. So there's definitely a level to which you kind of need to do things, and that's stuff that you don't realize until you've ran the game multiple times. And again, like the other thing, like when you run a game multiple times, is that players are great, but they're also the worst for accidentally taking things home with them. So you have to kind of work out what am I missing and what do I need to retake.
Yep.
So yeah, there's not much to I don't think there's like things haven't changed. Like it hasn't been optimized in any interesting way. I wouldn't say. But like if I look back at other games that like I've been involved in running multiple times, so the First Contact run, the massive 200 player game, like I think a lot of their cards were kind of like still exactly the same between each of the different runs. Again, like because they have, I mean, that's a 200 person game. If they didn't have upwards of 1,000 cards, I would be shocked more than anything else. I mean, I could go ask Chris how many it is, and I think he'd probably just start rocking in the corner.
Have an
to work out,
aneurysm.
like, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's probably worth doing, to be fair. Like, as everyone says, an important part of UK games culture is winding up Chris. But then, like, have you ever been, like, that's all been run, like, I think both the runs for that, when it ran in person, were exactly the same cards and things. There is a game that I've been involved in controlling and running called The Real Heroes, which is a game where everyone is a like superhero of some kind, and then you have some super villains on top of it. And Pickles, God bless his soul, has basically says to people, pitch me a superhero and I'll write you like a briefing and a whole bunch of action cards that match the theme of your character. So yeah, so if you want to, you can say, oh, I would like to be I want to be a superhero that uses music to like do this thing. And Pickles will just like write you a set of cards that like fit the mechanics, are roughly balanced, because Pickles is actually really good at game balance, and gives you like the upgrade tree that like everyone else would have. So like for the Real Heroes, like every single run of that will be different, because if someone says they want to design their own hero, then they can do, and they will be given a whole bunch of stuff. And then the other side of the Real Heroes is that you have some supervillains who have got a plot to like destroy the world in some interesting way. And again, each of those, it's very much a case of them speaking to Control and saying, here's my pitch for what my supervillain's going to be. Here's my pitch for how I think it's going to. Here's my pitch for like how I work. Here's my pitch for what my end goal is. And then again, like we then write all the plot for that. We then write all the action cards for that. That involves like an awful lot of heavy lifting for that. But it then means that like every one of the Real Heroes is completely different, because it is just a very different game. Like the plot's very different. The players that are there are very different. I know that we have. I think now that he's run it a couple of times, he's now got like a list of maybe like 30 or 40 heroes that he can just slot in if he wants to, and like tweak the briefing so that they can all interact in interesting ways. And you can do that with most games if you really want to. You can tweak if you want, but my humble opinion is that I don't really have the time to do that sort of nonsense. I'm happy to like spend ages like rewriting like 39 briefings, because that's, in the grand scheme of things, I've just got to write 100 words 39 times and like have a conversation with my control team and work out like, here are the plots, here are the people that are involved in that plot, and then write some stuff, and then a couple of the people can have like nonsense, silly plots that just affect them, and I don't have to worry about them. Like that's the thing. So yeah, I do love the Real Heroes. If anyone ever wants to run it, just be aware of the work that you're setting yourself up for.
Yeah. Well,
It sounds intense.
I think I reached out via you, Paddy, to get a hold of that game, and I was very intrigued by it. I did not realize that that he'd done that much work. It's admirable and terrifying, the idea of customizing every player's little brief for every game. But geez, it would create a very unique game every single time. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, for components, I mean, there is always going to be some amount of attrition. You will always need to pay a bit of money each new game to replace components that have gotten lost or messed up or taken away or anything like that. We did design our stuff for God Emperor for replay. Like it's all pretty schmick and fancy and able to be reused, but I guess when originally designing it, I didn't necessarily realize how much I was locking myself in to certain mechanics. And I think when you're deciding, like Paddy, you talked about it being Running Hot being a very card-driven mega game. When you have to print a ton of unique cards or different cards for a specific mechanic, if you want to use any of those cards again, you are locking yourself in to a specific type of experience. So with God Emperor, if we wanted to change, when we want to change the court around, that's pretty easy to do. The map, we are locked into a specific map layout because we have some nice art and a nice map and all that kind of thing of that particular layout. But any other mechanics around that we could change. The underground is card driven, and that means when we wanted to make changes, we're like, oh my god, there's so many cards we need to reprint and rechange and everything. So yeah, I guess that would maybe be something to just be aware of if you're planning to run the same game many times over and over and over. Just be aware of which parts you are locking down, and that you're like, when you print out that certain amount of cards that reference this certain mechanic, you are kind of creating a certain amount of inertia that mechanic hopefully sticks around. Otherwise, you've just wasted a bunch of cards that are going to have to go in the bin.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, Paddy, about sort of where you decide to draw the line of redesign versus reskinning or reflavoring. And I think it's important to know when to stop. And I don't think many people do know, which is fair because there's no definitive answer. But yeah, it's a good lesson to learn and to be ready for early on, especially if you're producing your first game.
And I think your point, Paddy, you talked before about the point when you slowly stop making mechanical changes. I think, at least with God Emperor, my vibe, and Watch the Skies or We Are Not Alone, my vibe has been that at a certain point, you will never have a perfect game, and there are some flaws that are going to be endemic to the design. In like for God Emperor, for example, it has this central mechanic where players can choose which table they go to each turn. They can go to the war map, the court, or the underground, and that creates certain central flaws. That there's a lot of good things about it, but there are certain things about that um aren't necessarily fantastic, which is you can have quarterbacking if a lot of people go to the same place, things like that. And I think at a certain stage, you have to accept some of those flaws as being part of the design, and like part of, like, we are okay with these because they buy us this interesting other interaction that goes on. And kind of, yeah, you have to learn to love a flawed creation, I guess, if you're running a mega game over and over.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're doomed.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, you were doomed as soon as you ran a mega game anyway. Like it's
Yeah.
it's a silly hobby. It's an absolutely silly hobby. I don't know why anyone does it.
Thank you. I've been trying to tell people this. It's it is cursed. I think it's a dangerous space. So I guess, Paddy, I'm keen to try to extract some succinct wisdom at the end of all this, but I guess my last question for you, specifically in tweaking things, changing things, learning to run games over and over, and not just running hot, but your experience with Den of Wolves and Watch the Skies and even First Contact. What's something, or what are things that you think you would probably do differently in retrospect if you had known, from the beginning, things that would have made running the same game over and over easier?
I think I got quite lucky with Running Hot. Like Running Hot is incredibly narratively flexible, just because of the way that it's set up. I think that's just a consequence of maybe have like how I design the game, and how I design games in general. What I remember intentionally when I was designing Running Hot, going like, here is this rule here's this rule, and here's the space that I'm like intentionally adding with that rule. Like, what does that give me? And then how can I give people interesting ways to interact with that and a reason to interact with that? So, like, Running Hot's got all this like these different plots that I can inject at any point, and I think that kind of is the main thing. Is like, if you're not running a specific style of game, if there's a way that you can go, here is like the various plots that can happen. How can I make sure that a player is in charge of that plot moving forward without me needing to be involved as game control? So that I know that means that the way that plot will move forward will always be unique unless I get exactly the same player in exactly the same role, and I have exactly the same 39 players running the exact same game with all the exact same briefings. So everything where possible, I want to make sure that you can always do like something completely differently. I'm gonna like put you in the can, and I'm gonna point you in a completely different direction. And if I point everyone in different directions, then the game will never be the same twice. Like the mechanic stuff will always be the same, like in theory, like once those have all settled. But everything else, like the interactions that the game is pointing you towards, or like both on a mechanic and narrative layer, if I can make sure that the game is flexible enough that I can point you in a different direction, that when you come back, that means that you will have a completely different experience because of it. And that's like that. I think that's what people should try and aim for when they're writing a game. Now, obviously, that doesn't work for like if you're running a historical game, for example. Like you're kind of not limited, but you're kind of set by the scenario that you're managing. And like some other stuff where you have like a central mystery, like Watch This Guys, you kind of got a bit of like you're kind of hamstrung by that, like as Jack said earlier. But then you've still got a bit of room to maneuver in, because like the Watch the Skies isn't about the aliens, it's about how countries interact, and then also aliens come to mess around with it. So even on the Watch the Skies level, you can tweak those briefings slightly. You can say, here is a reason. Oh, in the last one of this, you hated like Germany hated the UK. Well, in this one, actually, like Germany loves the UK but hates France, and you can tweak those relationships in some interesting way, and then like make sure you've got your injects that you can use to change the games and like tweak things in some ways. So Phase Anatomy, my magical whimsical mega game, like we have something in the region of like 100 injects, which we wrote 100 injects knowing that every run would only use 2 of them, because like that's just how it is. But those exist to cause a problem, which will then like some people will interact with that and then make that problem go away, or they will make it worse, as players tend to do. And like that means that there's something that they can interact with, and we will, if like, so the first run we have like the hedge fund thing where some bankers steal some hedges because that's what they think hedge funds are. Still the best joke I've written in that game. But like the next one, it didn't have that. I had some other nonsense. I can't entirely remember which one that we used for those things. But like there's this big long list of things that you can just inject and swerve it in an interesting way. And whether those are like little injects like that, so phase injects are all about here's a problem and here's like a rough mechanical way of solving it. But then like you can just change like the narrative of what's happening. So Running Hot's set in the UK, like what happens I think it was set before Brexit was really a thing, but like what happens if Brexit is a thing? What happens if like Brexit isn't a thing? What happens if Scotland decides to like vote for independence? Like those things like change the textural level of the game without me actually needing to do anything. I don't have to do anything with like any mechanics or anything. Like the game just changes because people go, oh, that's a thing. Like the narrative has changed. So how do I respond to that narrative? And that's how you make your game feel different for a multiple run. So it's again, once your game has settled. So if you're a new designer, I wouldn't suggest changing things like the narrative too much between things, so you can kind of have something to settle with. But then once you have like this cast iron thing, so you've bought yourself a Watch This Guys, you bought yourself a Den of Wolves, other mega games are also available. The real power you've got is like, what is it that I'm going to add to the game on a narrative level that's going to mean people have to act differently.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I'm not sure what else to add there, but I think you're spot on that. I guess more is less is more. There's so much complexity in a game. There's so much happening, and there's so many different perspectives that each player will bring, whether they are a new player or not, that it only takes like a tiny little comment here or a movement of a briefing, sentence there, and the entire game will just take on a whole different trajectory, and it won't matter whether people are expecting certain mechanics or not, because there's just so many push and pull from different people in the game that it's going to be unpredictable.
And like if you play a lot of if you've played a lot of mega games,
Hmm.
you all remember like that one little bit of the news that was like an offhand comment that half the game thought that's really important, and then suddenly
Yes.
it became really, really important. Like I always tell the
Very
story of
true.
like the first time I played Trope High, where I was someone from Venus looking for someone from Mars so that I could kill them all for some reason or whatever, and the news just offhandedly said that the Modern Foreign Languages building was closed, and the principal wasn't talking about it. So I was like, oh, that must be like where my plot's supposed to go. So I spend the entire game breaking into the Modern Foreign Language building. Like I end up getting transported to Mars. I end up getting transported to the jungle, a whole bunch of other stuff. And like that wasn't a plot that Becky had written at all. It was just something that Seamus just had to roll with, and he was like, "Yeah, you kind of just you wouldn't let go of that thing, so therefore it became your plot line, and there was nothing I could do about it." Like that's the sort of thing that you have to be ready for a player to do that, but also the way you be ready for is going like here's all this stuff that we can add to the game if we need to, so it will feel different.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is always the way. The things players clue into and jump on and latch onto are never what you expect them to. And almost the opposite. This year so far in the games I've been involved in running, there's been plenty of little things that I've seeded, plots or hooks or whatever you would like to call them. And a lot of the time the players have been like, well, I don't know what to do with that. Or there is too much else happening right now, so I'm just gonna put that in my back pocket, and then that's it. And then they go and pursue all the wacky stuff that they're doing already, and I get to sit back and remind myself that it is the player's game and not no one else's.
Absolutely, that's the wonder of it. I have a question for you, Pat. So my next design that I'm working on at the moment, one of my goals is to make it as replayable as possible and as easy and as interesting to do a lot of runs as possible. As someone who doesn't usually run the same game multiple times and many times, what in a design would convince you to try that or would make you interested in running the same game quite a lot of times?
Yeah, I don't know. I think so. I think simplicity is what has attracted me to games which I've wanted to run multiple times. The Generalissimo is dead. We've ran twice. We're selling tickets to the third run of it in 24 hours from recording, and it is. And I think I'm really attached to that game because its simplicity allows me and the facilitators to do so much with it, and the players. So I think simplicity of design, but also maybe modularity. So having little chunks that are optional, or it doesn't matter if they get forgotten or if they become, enter the spotlight, but just little bits and pieces to play with that give you a bit more of an insight into what the designer was thinking. I think that's always handy. So it feels like that's kind of conflicting messages, but I don't like crunch that is mandatory, I suppose. And I like a game that is light enough that if you just need to drop little bits and pieces off because they don't appeal to you or the audience, that's okay. Yeah, so mechanical lightness, I think. And I think the lesson I've learned about not running my own games many times is what both of you have already said. You need to accept the flawed design as it is, warts and all, and just settle on a point in time where you say, all right, it's done. Whether or not it's perfect or not, you just have to let it go out into the wild, and that's a point I just haven't reached yet, but I'm looking forward to.
Well, it can never be perfect, but that makes total sense, and I completely agree, and that's something I've thought about with God Emperor as well. Is that because there's a lot of interweaving bits and pieces and things going on, it's a lot harder than perhaps it should be to add your own new stuff onto it, or like, hey, I want to run it, but I want to add this new extra weird twist on it. It is a bit harder to do that than it is for a more rules-like game, maybe, than Generalissimo. So yeah,
Yeah.
completely agree.
And Paddy, you were talking about, giving advice to people who are picking up a new game off the shelf, and you mentioned Den of Wolves and Watch the Skies. Is Running Hot available for people if they're interested in grabbing it and giving it a shot?
I think that Michelle from the Megagame Coalition has been saying for like 2 years that she will happily help me package the game up into a format that can be consumed by someone else. So at some point, I will actually take her up on that offer and do it. It's not in an easily readily format at the moment. But really, what I need is someone to say, "Can I buy it off you?" And then I'll be forced to do like the bits that I need to do.
Well, you heard it here, everyone.
Yeah, you heard it here. Highest bidder.
As like the way that I work is entirely like if I don't have a deadline, it's not going to happen. So like I need deadlines. Like if no one asks me to do it, it's just not going to happen. When we designed Phase, we intentionally like designed Phase in a format that if someone asked us for it, we could actually just package it up and give it. Mainly because like the experience of trying to do that backwards to Running Hot has been so daunting that I've just not bothered. So Phase is in a format you can actually just buy from us, and I think Melbourne would say that it runs pretty much just out of the box without much of my brain. Whereas an awful lot of Running Hot is definitely in my brain.
Yeah, I think this emerging format of publication seems to be that you find the right audience to hand it over to, and say, you guys can have this, but you can help package it up, and it becomes a bit of a collaboration. I know a few groups have done that now with different games, and I think it helps having fresh eyes take on the big pack of craziness that you've produced, which I am well aware, like I'm very familiar with. That's what a lot of my games look like these days. And then calling it, asking questions, being like, where's that thing? And how do these two documents actually relate to each other? And where's that card? I think it helps, and it kind of gives you that deadline, which I think as well is a recurring trait that mega game designers need. They need deadlines. So self-awareness is good. Yeah. Okay. Well, Paddy, thank you for the chat. You've said already that you have run Running Hot many times, and it is almost ready to go and sit on the shelf for a little while. What are you working on? Can you tell us what you're working on next?
If you're interested in Running Hot, we're doing one more online run on the 14th of September, I believe. So that's running online, tickets available through all good ticket shops, by which I mean there's a link that I assume will be in the show notes. And then I think it's probably going to get like another in-person run in Reading, and I can't remember the date of that. But like, keep an eye on Reading Megagames for that. After that, I'm currently in the process of designing a game which is called Untitled Mech Game until I come up with a better title.
Yes.
So it's a game where you have some people who are like mech pilots who have come to a planet where the mechs all came from. It went offline for a while, and we've come back afterwards, and it's kind of like an investigation as to why did it go offline, and then the people that are there, like what have they been doing while it went offline, which is a game that I'm kind of designing out in the open. One of the things that we're trying to do with Pennine Megagames this year is we're running regular game design sessions every other month. So it's basically I'm designing that game kind of like in that thing, so that people who are not sure how to design a mega game, or like don't know where to start, or don't want to talk, or like all that sort of stuff. It's a environment where you've got like me, who has in theory successfully designed 2 mega games, and a whole bunch of other people who are experienced mega gamers. Like you can then talk through. Here's my idea for a game. Like here's what I've got. We can do some play testing. You can talk about the narrative or something. Like those have been really useful for me. And like a lot of the flaws in the original like design for Untitled Mech Game has been kind of like ironed out with that thing. So like I've now got a really good direction of where that's going to go. So that's the next thing that I will be designing. At some point, it will have a title. I just can't work out what a good one is.
I think Untitled Mech Game kind of does the trick for now.
Yeah, I feel like if I tried to get people to buy tickets for a game called Untitled Mech Game, I just don't think it would. I don't think it would work. Well, people would assume it's going to be a game of whimsy, and like although I do write games of whimsy, I think this one's going to be slightly more serious than everything else I've run. which I'm aware is like a major character flaw of mine. But I mean, having said that, like the last conversations we were having about what some of the corporations on the planet were going to be, did immediately swing into whimsy. So I might just have to lean into it.
It always inevitably gets there. All right, well, that sounds great. We will have links below to the online game on the 14th, and also Pennine and how to get in touch with the group. Paddy, thank you again. It was good to chat. Maybe we won't need to wait 4 years to chat next time. Maybe we can chat again soon about Untitled Mech Games. But appreciate your time, and hopefully this was of a little bit of help to those people out there interested in picking up games and running them for the same audience, for a different audience, but running the same game several times. So thank you very much.